And so we're moving into the full force of summer, and this is the season of the midday. Also, well, the South is the time of midday of rapid growth, expansion, and exploration. And this heat of the sun drives immense creativity and activity. And yet, this massive expansion does cause us to then bump into one another. And this friction forces a choice. So we either turn toward love or toward war. And most wars are founded on fear, while love is founded on trust. And so today we're going to explore whether it is even possible for us in our world right now to move from war to love, and what that transition requires of us, both personally and collectively. And we'll talk about the crux of this duality and why the path of surrender, which in many ways is the feminine journey, is essential for those of us who can imagine a way forward, even when refusing to engage the fight that feels like an act of death. So, if we refuse to engage in the fight, it feels like we die. And so there's this tremendous force, propelling us back in and making us feel like, we have no choice in some way. And currently our institutions are trapped in this, dangerous race to the top from the same fear. We fear that if we're not number one, if we're not dominant, in AI or in war or, war technology or whatever, we're defeated and relegated to being losers. Trump sort of acts as an archetypal expression of this fear. And while many in my community groan, whenever, he's in this space, I find I have to ask myself, how can I let go of my own need to be dominant? Because, he brings that up in me, so look, well, we have to defeat this guy, right? So we're so terrified of being dominated that the only way we know to protect ourselves is to dominate in return. And while hierarchies exist in nature, our true nature, undistorted by trauma, I believe, would seek happiness for all, equally. I believe our underlying nature is sort of being hijacked by these ancient fears of being on the bottom. And I'm sure we've all had karmic lifetime, experiences in other life, where, it was truly, miserable. We were slaves, or we were, the losers in war in one way or another. Even now, those losers in these battles are, the women are, raped, and, the men are killed. It's like, it's very, very serious. And yet, to move beyond this, we have to learn to navigate life, I think, with more consciousness, recognizing this trap, and seeking to find a way forward by exploring a little more this feminine journey as a necessary complement to the masculine hero's journey. And we must also envision new ways of collective decision making, learning to advocate for our perspective while, letting go of our way in service to collective wisdom. There's an exploration of holarchies, which are structures in line with natural order that might offer a path forward into kind of a model for participatory communities, though we have yet to really harvest the generative resources that, all of this wisdom holds. So we need to turn to nature, biomimicry, understanding this holarchic kind of principle and how it functions in our natural world. And also, look to see how we can adapt that or modify that in terms of human, communities, and start small. We can't do it globally, I don't believe. It's all like experiments. So our natural response really to injustice that we see is to fight and to feel that like we have to win, or else we suffer injustice, we die, or forced to submit to consequences that feel like death. So this win or die is a duality, right? And a very limiting duality, right? And from inside of that duality, we do not see any other possibility. But this is the thing with duality is like there's always distortion and divinity on both sides, so we can kind of work that out. And then there's always the third way, which is the balance point, the moving center that trusts in the benign direction of creation. And it's also interesting to me, this intersection of the like it is the crux of the cross, right? And so there's this idea that we're sort of impaled on the cross of space-time, and matter, and that that the extension of that cross is like representing this duality, and the heart, which is centered on the center pole, and where the duality intersects, then is the way beyond, and is the third option. And so in many, many traditions, this is kind of hinted at, but I find it is a very challenging and, you know, um, deep journey to understand fully, and then even beyond understanding, to be able to personally follow. So this path is not for the masses yet, uh, but I do hope in coalitions of people gathering to test this way, we can begin to explore and create collective experiences for ourselves, and find new ways in small communities. I think like they're sort of like one image is like there's these little boats on the sea, right? And these small boats are carrying, small communities of people learning how to row together and survive together, and find a new way. And then as more and more of them, do that, I think we'll, be able to maybe bring that into the collective. But it's a journey, and so this path is, something that we're, I think, needing to just find within ourselves first. And so there's this way that I know when I take a small thing to surrender to, just for practice, because it's like I can feel like this part of me, like if I'm in a line, or the traffic is moving slowly, it's like I can feel this part of me that wants to push, right? Wants to make it go faster, doesn't like being stuck, where I am or whatever. And, that's sort of an example, I think, of like, okay, so what happens if I can just relax out of this place of pushing? What death am I dying? And I think what we discover in these little tiny ways is that where we are surrendering, something opens up, and new possibility happens. So I'm going to get into this a little more later on in our discussion, but we have to kind of create a collective support for our explorations. And because in our dualistic world, cooperation can seem like a losing proposition, and surrender can seem completely crazy, right? Yeah, we tend not to go there. But I want to kind of bring up the other side of the truth, right? I mean, that makes sense, and it's why we resist. But what the true alternative is the real madness. And that real madness is to continue to destroy each other and the world in this race to the top. And so, there's a way that we know where that's going, right? And it cannot be good for, the globe or humanity. It may, you may have a few people that somehow come out on top, but I'd even doubt that. So it is time for the conscious person to find community and to work with their own fears, and learning to sort of explore and sit in the space of true surrender. So we recognize that our deep-seated fear of powerlessness fuels this cycle of dominance. And sort of the crux of our evolution lies in realizing that true power is found in benevolent surrender, and it, it's not the power that we're expecting or used to. So this is why we have to practice in these little ways. So this is the heart of the feminine journey, and we really don't have a lot of choice. I mean, we can be forced, because the world says, like we're stuck or we can't go forward, or somebody says we're stuck, or maybe we get stuck, but we really, are not able to go forward, and so we can be in that space in resistance to it, or we can be in that space in merger and kind of hopelessness and defeat, or we can be in that space in a third possibility. And that's what we're trying to get to, that accepts the current state of things, right? Okay, so this is not changing, this is where I am. Maybe I'm not happy no so much about where I am, but if I can breathe and be with it and relax into it and stop either resisting or merging with it, then that will begin to move. And the movement is coming from, I don't know, the self that's larger than our ego personality, or the universal self, all of me. I'm not sure, but there is a current, there is a divine current, there is a force that is, in a way, trying to orchestrate in harmony and in the highest order of things. And it is all of our fears, defenses, resistances, mergers, all of that, that kind of just churn this flow, this water that's, this movement that's, in kind of a harmonious and direction that's natural and positive to itself, into more chaos and difficulty. And so we don't really understand how much we churn our own waters that way. And that, all of, even on the international, scale, we're doing it all the time. I can watch it, so but there is, this movement that is actually got, like what we're looking for, and yet we don't see it. It's invisible. We can't predict it. We don't know that it's really trustworthy. We're not used to, accepting it or working with it. And so this is the big shift and the mystery that we have to explore and discover. So, and then, when we can move out of this competitive ego-driven mind and into a higher consciousness, then it's like not an act of death, but the vital act of cooperating with the life force itself. Right? Because we're trusting that something bigger than we understand is trying to happen, and this is what is, and that must be a part of that unfolding, right? And it may not be the best in our current circumstance or whatever, but that we do develop a kind of understanding that there is this force that has the highest interest of all, and that can actually, you know, when we learn to work with it, can be a superpower within ourselves and our own lives, as well as, for others. So when we surrender our attachment to winning, we open ourselves to this new way. And instead of waiting for the masses to catch up, we look to the power of, like our communities, the little boats that, are trying to explore this. We're still infants. We're new. We have to learn how this new way works. So we can think of these small intentional communities or coalitions sailing on the sea of life, and these little boats serve as essential laboratories and testing grounds where we can experiment with holarchy-based cooperation, practice, and consciousness, and demonstrate that we can stand firm against injustice without being consumed by the battle. And by coming together in these small, supportive, communities, we create a different energetic frequency, and we prove within ourselves how, we discover how to handle conflict, share resources, and navigate this downward curve that we're in of this changing time, but, secure in our boats together, right? And as these little boats become more numerous and interconnected, we create the collective capacity to live beyond this duality of win and lose. And I believe that even in our small little boats, in spite of everything that's happening in the world, those boats will stand the best chance of, survival and comfort and, peace and a way of navigating that, won't face quite the dangers that, are here for us. And and so maybe that's a vision that's a little, I don't know, Neptunian, a little expanded and not so grounded. But I think something like that, is needing to, guide, is here and is guiding us. Pathwork talks about it, many systems now are saying that there's, something, bigger than our history, than humanity itself, that this is a transition in, a larger way than we can fully understand from our little human perspective. So, um, as we're learning all of this, this is how we can find our way beyond this apparent end and into a reality that's rooted in trust and mutual support and the unfolding of a shared purpose, a community and a divine purpose, right? Um, there's something, that we will have the deepest pleasure in doing together, way beyond the pleasure of winning or being on top. And that's what we're seeking. So, in my experience, every time I have been forced to surrender, the initial results were, from my resistance were painful, and often more so because, I really am not good, very good at surrendering. I, find that, my sort of dominant defense position, is a very strong fighter. And, so I would swing oftentimes between feeling, like if the position was like totally immovable, right, by my will or anything else, I would swing between feeling defeated and being forced to submit because I didn't have the capacity to do something else, and then I could only tolerate that for so long, and then I was back into the fight, and this over and over and over again cycle that we do. um, as we're actually studying this whole thing of surrender, because in order to really learn it internally in our bodies and our psyches, like in some ways we have to go back and forth between these poles of the duality, of the fight versus the submission. And uh, and and finally, the will finds its way through. It's like, and for me, it's found its way through in certain circumstances, and then I'm still in the battle in others, right? So, but I think each time we learn, we also discover that this miracle follows, right? It's like when I'm in submission and fight back and forth still, I'm caught. I'm on the cross. I'm trapped in this painful situation. And often, you kind of get completely exhausted, and then again you kind of give up for a little while, and then you go back to the fight. But each time I finally found some way, because the universe wasn't changing its, position. And that, in some ways, I like, if we're fighting against a human being, it feels more difficult. But so there's a lot of things that are just facts of life that are just is that we don't like to surrender to. Our aging, our difficulties, in health, and, just, the weather, the way things are that affect and defeat our plans, or our hopes and our dreams and that kind of thing. And so larger movements of the political situation, all of these things are way beyond the individual. And when we find one of those that we can't really change, there is a way that we can explore the desire to dominate it, as well as the impossibility of that. And how do you get out of the hopelessness, right? Of the submission, of the collapse, so that you can still find a way forward, that is not also, still at war, in battle, in hatred, and, instead of the fear, in love, right? So the fear is what drives the war, is what drives the battle. And so it's a big it's a big challenge and a big puzzle on the blackboard that we're all exploring. And so each time when I finally did find this place of surrender, that's when like something else happened, something new happened, back and forth, years sometimes in these places. And then when you finally find that place, like maybe for a minute it feels like, oh, now I'm dead in some way. But just by accepting the dead, truly, truly surrendering, then that new life, then something happens, something changes, just in the fact that we're no longer, in this defensive posture, this, forcing current, like we approach things slightly differently. And just that difference in our energy, all of a sudden things start moving again, start flowing. There'll be twists of fate, something will show up that we weren't expecting, that, we'll have the solution that, we've been waiting for years, and so life participates with us, in these amazing sorts of responses to our quest. And it kind of has to stay firm in not responding to our demand for submission, you know, to life, to get life to be the way we want it to be, because our job is to learn to surrender to the way life is, and to realize that that's not the death that we fear, but that in fact has everything in it we want. And yet this is, kind of like magical thinking, or, like when you're in that place of staring down the death, it is a shamanic death, so there is this rebirth that's trying to happen, but it feels real. And the only way that you know that it's something else is you have to jump to your death. So interesting, in the path work, the guide says, like all these little das are practice for our big one. And this is a whole other journey when we get to the north and the medicine wheel that we can talk about, and there is this, reality of death in the midst of life. And so part of, the deaths in the south, which are the consequences of war, or the fears, of, you know, losing our domination or whatever, all of these things are, part of the uh, practice, and exploration of this, illusory, in a way, state of death. There's an emotional reality to it, but in a sense, spiritually, nothing dies. And when we can learn to trust that larger field, then, we'll discover the truth of that is in fact, obvious and present for us. But each time it is like jumping off a cliff, you know, and each time I think we have to honestly wrestle with God. We have to honestly fight until we decide that fighting is not really going to be the answer. And so, if we finally have that, positive result, maybe the feared outcome, would crack open, and this way through would be discovered, right? It's kind of like everything that you expected to be the worst case scenario. It doesn't mean that there might not be some hardship, but you were expecting death, and what happens instead is something else. So trusting this does feel magical and unrealistic to our rational and material consciousness. But if we can explore this in little matters, and discover, kind of how it works in some of the small battles we're in, then I think we begin to develop more faith, more trust in it, to apply to some of the bigger, more scarier things. So I always find grace when I manage the true trust of surrender. It is a living, available power, but it's only those who have been marginalized and had to, sort of been forced in a way into surrender, like, or they got to surrender through a forced submission, right? Um, and then they found their way into the healing space of the true surrender, right? That it's often the people that have already been abused or, somehow dominated over, that have had to face a shaman's death, and they are the ones in some ways that are the leading, you know, group of people that will find the way forward, right? So it is the wounded ones, the marginalized ones that have already explored and worked with these deaths in a way that hopefully can help as we move into a greater space of finding a new way forward, right? So sorry, I'm kind of looking at my notes here and trying to figure out. I was exploring one place and now I'm shifting. So I think we have to do a lot of work here as we're like learning to navigate this aspect of life with more consciousness. And we have to envision ways of collective decision making as well. So like there's this inner work with the we're the holarchy within, with all of these parts, and like the integration of that, and then to be integrated into a collective sense of decision making and harmonizing when we're coming, each one of us, from unique perspectives and differences. And so we need to both learn how to advocate for our vision, our understanding, and yet to let go of our way if it's in service to the collective good and collective wisdom. And so even we can still be right, but it may not be good to just force that or stand in that place, like there's a timing, like for everybody to understand that and get on board, right? And we have to step back and allow sort of the natural flow of things. And again, this is more of this feminine way of working. um, and so it's never going to be perfect, and that's also something that we learn acceptance for. It's like our beloved leaders and teachers and parents and best friends, they disappoint us. They are often um, you know revealers of imperfection that we are conscious of through them in some ways. So when we can think of the exploration of, of this whole field, and look at it from the individual and then also from the collective, how do we govern, or how do we cooperate with each other? How do we, come back into community, into tribe? Because the individual lonely way is not the answer, right? Um, so I think the exploration of the notion of holarchies, which are in line with the natural order, have already given us some interesting structures that can help us move into community and the wisdom of community. And we've yet to realize, much less harvest, the vast resource a deeply participatory community can be, and how generative and creative it can become. So if we think of the community also like a body, a healthy body with many parts, cooperating together, like the whole, when it's all supported, is really amazing. And then if like in our bodies, there are certain critical support things, but generally the heart's not fighting with the liver for attention or being right or something like that. I mean, in some ways it does, but I think you follow the point. Like there's this harmony and this synchronicity and the synchrony of each part specializing, and each part having a role, and each part also being its whole self, but combining with a collective to create something even more, even, fuller. So there's a lot, I think moving in that kind of exploration now, and maybe people can find some ways to explore and participate in some of that. Um, and then in this podcast, I want to explore how we might move forward with what it takes individually also and collectively. But there's this great transition the Pathwork Guide talks about in the lectures, it calls it the great transition from fear to love. And it's kind of like the understanding that as we move, we've kind of met the limits of our current system, our hierarchical, our dominant, and so that's what has to change for us to go forward as a planetary, healthy planet and as healthy individuals. So in our collective and personal memories are the painful and often undigested feelings of abuse and disregard that comes from, feeding on the bottom, from being, at the bottom of the hierarchy. And we've all grown up in hierarchical, unjust systems. So in some ways, I'm sure Trump was belittled as he belittles others, right? Uh, and the pain of being on the bottom, the fear of that drives his illusions and quest for power. I mean, that's his death. And he can never lose. So I don't know where we're going to go with Iran, but this is an underlying, psychological issue in his own defense structure. And so the combative defense is sort of interestingly, I think, through him being reflected to us collectively. And I'm not an apologist for Trump, but I do see him as a mirror for something in us all, and showing us, revealing the problem on the blackboard, is how do we individually and collectively choose another way? Um, and we can see how seductive this way is, and how many people, kind of like it's like a cult following, right? And so there's this, you know, issue that we're confronted with, and because this way is history, and history really is at an end. All of this has been the history of our civilization for at least 5,000 years. Conquest, dominator, sort of territorial, like who's on top, who's on the bottom. And and so, I think that's really the span of what we call history, what our known history is in many ways. And I think it's a part of the dynamic that's built into, that time frame. It was a learning, it was a teaching experiment, and we all had experiences of being on the top and being on the bottom, and in between and all of that. So it's kind of like the earth, it's run out of time on the earth. Maybe there's another place that people can go explore that system and learn from it. But right now the planet couldn't survive much more of that, and so I think there is some kind of evolutionary process that's going on, and that this whole system that we've known for all of this time is going to transform itself. And we think it's impossible, but so is a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, which happens lots of times. Right? There's some amazing things about the way nature um, does things, right? And so I fully sense that it's within nature's capacity to lead us through, consciously through, this process of transformation. So we're at a very, amazing and powerful time, and also a very fraught time, and challenging time. And I work all the time with the fears that it brings up in me. So uh, it's something that our natural response to the fear is to fight and to feel like we have to win or else we die. and we're forced to submit to horrible consequences that, would be death for us. And so we fight back, and in doing so become the same as that which we are fighting. And so we, in a sense, have to win at all costs. So how can there be another way? Fight to, fight to win or die, seems to be the only choice. But this choice is a duality, a win-lose, either or, extreme between two poles. And so the third way, the alternative, is something in the middle, the crux of the cross, the balance point, the moving center that has enough trust in the benign direction of creation, and that we can love ourselves through the temporary death, the loss, and the discomfort of the moment. This is different than, enduring, although sometimes that's all we can do. But if we surrender to the what is as a temporary, the guide says the lower self is always temporary. If we surrender to the negativity of what is, of the problematicness of what is, but not as a submission to a forever state, right? Not as a defeat into hopelessness, but as an awareness that we are, moving through, and it is a temporary and moving reality, moment to moment, that is unfolding. And the more that we can let ourselves relax and trust and accept the moment as a necessary, loss, but momentary, it's like something new is being born at the same time. And instead of resisting the what is, or the fear of what it might become, which is also, a lot of where we're in resistance. We don't even know, but it could be, so we're already, and I'm pointing the finger at myself, we can allow the power of the universe when we can, like, see if we can trust, and see what happens. And what we need to move through us moment to moment is this power of the universe, right? And so, like, when we resist in the moment what is, it's like we're kind of damming the natural flow of things. And then we get stuck as this dam, holding back what's trying to actually carry us to the place that we want to go. And so when we resist, there's an old saying, what you resist persists. And so this is I think another piece of wisdom that I've experienced, right? And as we, as we resist something, it, really does kind of congeal in stronger and stronger forms. So if we can allow the power of the universe and what we need to move through us moment to moment, then we can discover a slightly different reality than the one that we've always lived in. And I think if we look at nature, like, she kind of lives in that. I mean, trees can't run or fight, they just, plants, I think there are plant cesters, and they're good models of surrender, and rocks, and, everything, and it's all, again, transformed, and there is a transformation of form, you know, but, and I think within each individual, that's a part of also what we're doing. We sort of brought in a form that is evolving and learning, and the higher form is really where it's going, but we're afraid in a way that, you know if we don't fight and win, then we, will end up in a lower form instead. So again, I want to kind of just reiterate that sort of the surrender thing. It's a great puzzle, right? For me, I think for everybody, like, we don't even like the word. It feels like defeat. I like it better than submission, right? Which I think is what we mean when we talk about defeat. Um, and it's never an accepted. That's the difference between submission and surrender. Is there's a certain acceptance. of what is, of the defeat, if you want to call it that, temporary in the surrender. And in the submission, it feels like it's a forced thing that, has to be, and it's going to be held over us seemingly forever. And so we not only lose in this moment, but we lose in all future moments, and have to submit to a kind of stasis and suffering that, truly is unbearable, right? So there's an image, that in that's not true, and so if we can, again, relax out of, oh, we're stuck here forever belief structure, and relax, then the flow is restored, and then the movement is restored. So instead of resisting the what is, again, or the fear of what it might become, we can allow the power of the universe and what we need to move through us moment to moment. And in wiser understandings, sometimes what we need is a fast, is a deprivation, is a not having, everything as we want. There's great development and power and resilience, even in nature's evolutionary thing, the resilience that is created by sometimes the stresses of life are part of, what keeps populations strong and healthy. So, we're trying to, learn that instead of resisting the what is or the fear of what it might become, again, we can allow the power of the universe and what we need to move through us moment to moment. And this is how nature balances and regenerates from all loss. And she is indomitable in some basic dimension. And she will bring us to our knees to learn this truth, to learn how to flow in her larger comprehension, and her less sort of egocentric, selfish, self-centered understanding of life. So this is not something that the masses, again, are going to do anytime soon, and that's okay. There's a, way of guiding, I think, as we find our truth in that, and live it, the results will speak for themselves, that will attract naturally, and so these things will, again, evolve gradually. It's not going to happen overnight. Um, and so as we gather and form coalitions of people that can explore this other way, and see the beauty and the power, even in imperfection, of this attempt at cooperation and service to something greater than the individual, but still totally supporting the individual, right? It's not like I think our problem in the past was that the community was so dominant over the individual that it was imbalanced in the other way. And so we're, swinging into the whole individual thing, which is good. We need it. But now we got to go back to that center and find that center. So we need to create collective support for these explorations, and, ways, because at face value in our dualistic world, cooperation does seem like a losing proposition to most people, and surrender does seem kind of like a madness. So it is, I think, more mad to continue to destroy each other in the world as we're doing now in this current fear-based race to the top. And so it's time now for the more conscious person to find community and to work with their fears and challenges to sitting in this space of true surrender. This is the way, and yet it is not so easy or natural for humans. And in my understanding, the best way we can begin to learn to trust it is to apply to the little disharmonies that we face. And we talked about that. So, like, I know you are, in this place of surrendering to, many things in your world, and so when you notice that surrender is difficult, like, okay, the weather, messes up your vacation. You're going to feel some disappointment. You're going to have to deal with kids' disappointment, whatever, and so not ideal, but that kind of, we can accept and grieve that, in a way that allows, us to adapt and move forward. Right. And so, all of these little things in life that we're continuously confronted with, that is not how we would like it or the best that we would like it to be, then, all of these are beautiful, practice fields for um, learning a different experience of surrender, that it, when we do that, it actually helps the situation rather than puts us in a disadvantaged situation. So, and then we can also surrender and still act when there's opportunity. It's kind of like the serenity prayer. We're asking for discernment. So if there's something that can be changed, if I may not be able to change the weather, but we may change the plans, and that's good. And change in the moment. So we don't have to just sit in disappointment and be stuck not doing anything, right? Uh, so there's action and determining kinds of actions that can be done, but it is the serenity prayer to discern what it is that can be changed in this moment and what cannot. And our health depends on our ability to accept, that those things that we can't change, and then also our capacity to change the things that we can. And this is our greatest agency. So in our world, the acceptance, the wisdom, and the power of acceptance is not really fully understood. And it largely feels like some kind of a losing proposition. So to understand this, we must recognize that it is our deep-seated fear of powerlessness that fuels the cycle of dominance. And we fear that if we don't win, we will be crushed. Yet the crux of our evolution lies in realizing that true power is found in the practice of benevolent surrender. This is the heart of the feminine journey, as we said before, and I want to go into it a little more now. A movement out of the competitive, ego-driven mind and into higher consciousness. It is not an act of death, but the vital act of cooperating with the life force itself. So, this is partly how I navigate it too. I don't force myself to surrender. I should surrender. I think I should, I just wait until life says surrender. and I can usually tell when that is. I still may fight it, but it's kind of like a pretty clear guidance system. And then another way is, like when we surrender our attachment to winning, we open ourselves to a sort of new way of governance, and one that supports the individual within the collective. We don't have to wait for the masses to catch up. Instead, we can look to the power of the little boat and think of these as small intentional communities or coalitions that, can practice and work with these ideas to, evolve them into, a larger support network for everybody, and to call everybody to a higher model of what could be, right? So we have to model these things, and these little boats serve as essential laboratories, testing grounds, where we can experiment with this kind of consciousness and find a way, to really explore, who we are in our collective synergy together, right? It could be really exciting, right? So by coming together in these small supportive containers, we also create a different energetic frequency. And we feel inside, our strength and our ability to handle conflict, share resources, and as we said before, navigate this downward curve of the change together. And so, finding our way beyond the apparent in that we're and into this reality that is rooted in trust and mutual support, and an unfolding of a shared divine purpose that is connected. We're we're in the presence of it through our own life experience. It's not just a theory. So I always find, each time I do surrender, the feared outcome would end up having a little crack in the cosmic egg, and a way through would unfold somehow almost magically, or, it would be discovered. Sometimes I felt almost, psychically, the guides were helping me or something, like something would pop into my head that I have no idea where it came from, and oh yeah, that's helpful, right? So, we're such larger systems than what the little ego experiences itself as. And so we can't access those larger systems until we're more relaxed and calm and, less fear in our system. So, we're just learning to sit with fear. And again, I like the understanding that we can't suppress it or we can't deny it, that really what fear within us, if we can bring it into the consciousness, so it's, like, or we feel just general anxiety or whatever, but we can acknowledge it, right? Like we're not trying to separate ourselves out of our fear. I think in my journey, I've learned that things will transform, if we can actually go and be present with them. And so this cultivation of our conscious self in presence that can, just go be with all of these fears and anxieties. And I think if I was in the middle of, like some kind of, war of some kind, like in truly a threatening situation, they would be still maybe not so easily to come by, our animal nature, our life, death, we're humans. And so, but I think having that foundation could also help me. I think of a friend of mine who, was robbed, mugged in Baltimore, and he was able to find a place of centered love in himself and, communicate and hold that space, and the muggers let him go. So I really do believe that there are, ways that love is the superior weapon or the highest, power that we have. And yet, you know, we have to let go of our fear of surrendering, because otherwise we stay stuck in the battle, in the war, and we just keep trying to outdo the other guy, and we think we're going to feel safe that way, or finally we're going to dominate and defeat, get rid of everybody in the world that's against us. That's what Israel's trying to do, I guess. So there's a way that these things clearly, you know don't make sense, in the truth, when the reality of what's happening is seen. And then it does challenge us to look at this seemingly impossible third way. And I want to just, again, I've been summarizing a lot, or reiterating a lot in this, but, you know, to leave you with one final reminder, practice on the little things, because that will build your faith in, like something higher that's actually benign and supportive of you, and is working for you. And to the degree that we struggle or fight or go into our fear, we block that, and lose our sort of resource in that way. Okay, well, I think we're getting close to the time to close, and so it was, good to reconnect and share some of my wild thoughts on all of this, and I hope it was useful for people. Um, we'll continue in a couple of weeks. We're going to be getting into some continued really interesting material, so I've got some good lineups coming, so I hope you can, you know, follow us, join us, and that you are receiving something from these little explorations that I like to do. Okay, see you in a couple of weeks. This is Earthwalkways. I'm Darlene Rollins.